Thursday, September 27th. Welcome to the Matt Sager Podcast. I'm Matt Sager, and kind of a stressful day, huh? This Kavanaugh hearing, I don't think he's coming off very well. I mean, his accuser seems very credible. As someone who has survived what is being termed, I guess, an unsuccessful sexual assault, I don't find that to be any less upsetting, nor do I find it any more consoling that someone who failed at sexual assault is therefore qualified to be permanently installed to the Supreme Court. Basically, sort of an American king, a guy with the power to say, well, I haven't really told you my views about medical marijuana, abortion, voter rights, etc., but don't let this hysterical woman from my past actually describe anything about me. The whole purpose of this hearing is that I be rubber stamped into a position of permanent authority. So yeah, it's been a stressful day. But let's see, maybe he redeemed himself. Maybe he said something so cogent, so clear, so morally forthright that in spite of these accusers that are seemingly multiplying by the day, that we can entrust him with the safety of our country and with the laws that will shape us going forward. Let's hear from Mr. Kavanaugh.
This guy just he's pissing all over us. He's pissing on you. What does it taste like?
Oh.
Chief, what does it taste like? Because you know what? It tastes like piss. To me.
You know, that's the wrong Kavanaugh. I apologize. That's Lieutenant Kavanaugh from The Shield, expertly played by Forrest Whitaker. And by the way, talk about criminal and criminality. I don't think there's anything more criminal than that The Shield is not lauded as one of the most influential, amazingly written, directed, and performed television series of our lifetimes. Without The Shield, there would be no Breaking Bad, no Better Call Saul, no The Wire, no nothing. Glenn Close was the star for a season before Forrest Whitaker took over her role. David Mamet wrote an episode that she performed in. And listen, there would be certainly no Sons of Anarchy and Mayans MC. Kurt Sutter was a writer, producer, and director on The Shield. And those three series do share a universe of sorts. But yeah, I prefer all of that to talking about real-world news today. In fact, even listener emails about stuff that's really, really inconsequential in the scheme of things. Certainly less consequential than Supreme Court hearings. I got a couple emails and tweets today asking me my opinions on a couple different comic-related things. And you would think, a break from the news. Let me think about comics for a moment. That's something that's as far from reality, as inconsequential as it gets. So, one of the first things I was referred to was a book called Heroes in Crisis. The first issue in what I believe is going to be an 8-issue miniseries, might be 12, written by Tom King, who's a really interesting writer. And I'm just going to sum up my feelings about this particular book as follows.
No, sir, I didn't like it.
It's a book about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which somehow has come up not only in comics, but on this podcast a number of times recently. I feel that comics handles the issue really ham-fistedly, and as such ought to stay off the topic entirely. And yes, one might argue that I would feel more passionately about this issue than others, because I am someone who suffers from and lives with a very serious form of PTSD. But on the other hand, I would argue that makes me a pretty good critic of entertainment. Anything that is designed to bring PTSD to the public eye, to characterize it a certain way and say, hey, this disease is misunderstood. Here's how it really works. Here's an example of it in the form of entertainment. Now maybe you can understand PTSD and those who live with it a little bit better. I did not get that from Heroes in Crisis. Now, when I refer to Tom King as interesting, I first discovered him a couple of years ago. He wrote a miniseries for Marvel. Just as Marvel and I, and really comics and I in general, were sort of just having I guess Gwyneth Paltrow would refer to it as a conscious uncoupling, I had realized that although there was an enormous amount of talent, and I'd loved these books for my entire life, that it had just simply become all too clear. Just as I'd seen this happen with music, movies, the press, the battle between creativity and the bean counters, that's a fight that's been waged since the dawn of time, certainly since the invention of these mediums. But there's no longer any balance of power. The bean counters hold complete sway. They've infiltrated the ranks of the creatives, and so every comic is now an event. There was once this idea that was held in Marvel and other comic companies that every comic is someone's first. And so you should never pick up a comic and have a warning on the front page of a $3.99 to $5.99 comic book that says, warning, don't read this book until you've read issue X of comic book series Y. issue number 12 of another comic series, and another issue of an event miniseries, which is running late, which won't come out until May, and this is April, so don't read this at all. It had just gone completely out of control, and yet out of nowhere, this character that prior to Avengers Age of Ultron had been really largely ignored for the last several years, both in the comics and the films, the Vision. Tom King did a 12-issue miniseries about the Vision for Marvel that was one of the best comic stories I've ever read. It was so beautifully depicted. You know, this is a comic about an android, albeit an android with human characteristics, sort of complicated and convoluted human origins, all of which are explained within this miniseries. So you could come to this book knowing nothing about the Vision, or knowing only what you've seen of him in the Avengers movie. In telling this masterful story about the Vision, Tom King also lays out his very complicated, very convoluted origin, streamlines it so that anyone can understand it and ease into it, while at the same time hitting every important story beat and change and evolution in the character's arc, which dates back now 50 years. It was just one of the best comics ever, and it made me think, my God, where has this Tom King been? How has he escaped my notice? So I sought out more of his work, and the first thing that I found was a novel he'd written a few years earlier, a superhero novel called A Once Crowded Sky. And because I was so interested in this Tom King, and how, wow, there is suddenly this is like an Alan Moore level talent we're seeing, clearly. And so it was really baffling to me that just a few years prior, he'd written this novel, and it was just awful. I mean, really bad. As bad as The Vision was good, maybe worse. This lack of editing, this reliance on verbal phrases that it appeared as if it was just cut and pasted large parts of it. And the parts that weren't, the creative stuff, was so incomprehensible, and the stuff that you could understand varied between the self-important and the shallow. So it's like, oh, okay, maybe Tom King and I have a lot in common. Because I've done episodes of, for instance, this podcast and listened the next day and gone, ooh, that one kind of stunk, but tonight's going to be great. And that night usually is great. So Tom King is, I guess, what I would refer to as an uneven genius. The other thing that's interesting about him, I read up on him, and I've sort of befriended him, having met him at conventions, and we've befriended each other on social media. He's a very likable guy, and a really interesting one. A guy who, like me, loved comics in his childhood, and either maintained or rekindled his love for comics as an adult, and was an intern for, I believe, Marvel and DC, before leaving to become a CIA operative and take part in our various clandestine wars over the past decade or so, before dropping out of that and going, you know what's more fun than war and doing intelligence ops and fighting overseas and seeing all kinds of horror shows? I would like to take the intelligence, the humanity that I've seen, the good, the bad, the crazy, the unbelievable, and channel that into comics. And that's what I saw in The Vision. Obviously, I didn't see so much of this in the book, A Once Crowded Sky, but it did seem that he was perfectly situated to finally, unlike the terrible depiction of PTSD that we're seeing in the comic The Life of Captain Marvel, and certainly unlike Iron Man 3, in which Tony Stark is like, oh, there were aliens here, so I've got PTSD, and I'm going to show it by freaking out at random for no reason, and I'm going to get cured by a 10-year-old boy story MacGuffin. Sorry if I spoiled Iron Man 3 for you, but really, I'm not spoiling much. Tom King seemed like a guy who would have the absolute perfect credentials to actually address this issue in the pages of comics. And you know, I think if someone is not capable of tackling an issue this important, this monumental, really, and this misunderstood, that they shouldn't tackle it at all. But Tom King is absolutely. I believe it's entirely possible, if not likely, that he's experienced PTSD. And if not, I'd find it very hard to believe that he hasn't had friends, coworkers, people he's questioned or interrogated. He's seen PTSD. So it seemed to me that, yeah, if there's going to be a book about it, let it be Tom King, who's a great writer regardless, and who might have real expertise and insight on the subject. Well, again, I read the book cover to cover, and as I said...
No, sir, I didn't like it.
Yeah, I think you walk away from this comic thinking, okay, PTSD makes you tell bad jokes, makes you kill tons of people for no reason, makes you start an event that just seems designed to... You know, DC is on a real positive streak as a company. Not so much with the movies, obviously, although hopefully they're going to turn that around, but with TV and with comics. You know, in, I believe it was 2011, they finally did what Marvel had been doing every few months or so and did a reboot of their entire line of comics. They went in a little too hard. They did this thing called the New 52, where just the entire 75 years of comics we've been doing up till now that we've tried to provide some sort of explanation for, tried to explain why Superman was 30 in 1945 and is 31 in 2018. They had at least tried, and to a certain degree succeeded, at streamlining at least a degree of verisimilitude. Like, you don't go to comics for realism. You go to comics because they're comics. But if you don't maintain at least a little bit of an investment in the characters and the world in which they live, why are you spending this astronomical amount of money on a hobby that is just turning you off, that is taking everything you've invested in and sort of pissing on it? And that, certainly unintentionally, was what the New 52 did. And after a couple of years, DC really acknowledged this. They realized it, and they found a way to take the people who had come over, the new readers who had discovered DC via the New 52, and the billions of readers who they had turned off with the New 52, and bring them together to once again form a cohesive universe that could basically explain away the New 52 without saying, no, it never happened, the way that the New 52 had done with the original DC universe. It was something called Rebirth, and it's still ongoing, and it's doing quite well. And so in this atmosphere, under these editors who are doing so well, with this creative team who's working on the main Batman comic, and Tom King, who really ought to know his stuff when it comes to PTSD, I don't know exactly what I expected, but I expected to feel like, okay, this is a legitimate story that legitimately tackles PTSD, and I feel okay about it. I ended up actually contacting Tom King and saying, I don't mean to offend or insult or anything like that, but just FYI, I'm a guy who lives with PTSD. I read your book today. I found it incredibly insulting. I think it's going to make people understand the disease even less. I think it further stigmatizes the disease. I think it's a disaster and a shame, and I look forward to hearing a response from him, because I'm far from the only person who's upset about this series. Many people who don't have PTSD at all or don't even know what it is are simply furious because he killed off like half the DC universe in 20 pages with no story or explanation. But along the way, he did occasionally touch on, hey, here's somebody suffering from PTSD, doing something crazy, acting silly, acting stupid, getting killed, killing someone. It was just all over the road. It was a big mess. And the other thing I was asked about was the trailer for Dark Phoenix. And it looks to me, I'll attach a link to the trailer along with a link to commentary on it from someone who would know much better than me. A woman named Grace Randolph, who at one point in time worked for Marvel, left around, I believe, 2013, just as I was really starting to realize that comics were all about bean counters, creating never-ending events. She seemed to have held similar views, and she may have uttered them behind closed doors at Marvel, and I believe that led to an ignominious falling out with the company and her. But she does a breakdown of the Dark Phoenix trailer that's much better than anything I could do, other than to say, it appears to me on its face that what they're doing is taking the worst X-Men movie ever, X-Men The Last Stand, the one that made them reboot the universe entirely cinematically and recast Professor X, that made them go back to the well, and that made them do First Class, which was a great movie. A movie, albeit with diminishing returns, just like the first X-Men, because that led to X-Men Days of Future Past, which was okay, and then X-Men Apocalypse, which was just awful. And now it would appear as though X-Men Last Stand is being remade in this X-Men universe, making it just uninhabitable and in need of yet another reboot. It just seems like a really depressing state of affairs when it comes to comics and comics media. So bad that, in fact, I might go back to watching the Supreme Court hearings to cheer me up. Although I'll say this, I watched another trailer that was recommended to me by many listeners for Daredevil Season 3 coming to Netflix October 19th, and hot damn does that look good. Yes, admittedly, it is a tiny bit silly to see the Kingpin in his comic book suit, and even sillier to see Daredevil wearing the suit he wears in the Trial of the Incredible Hulk. Google that and then watch this trailer. You'll see it's the exact same costume. Black leotard, essentially. But he wears it well, and the trailer certainly hints at the classic storyline, Daredevil Born Again. It's an amazing story, and I believe that that story is going to be retold in at least some capacity in Daredevil Season 3. So I am incredibly excited for that. How about you? What are you excited about? What has you depressed, happy, sad, anxious? Let me know. Get in touch with me. Email matt@mattsager.com, call 646-535-4788, and hit me up on social media, too. Twitter's @MattSager, Instagram's Real Matt Sager, Facebook is The Matt Sager, my voiceover page there is Matt Sager VO, and this podcast page is Matt Sager Podcast. And for more of those social media links, along with articles, blog posts, my contact info, voiceover reels, more episodes of this podcast, and all kinds of stuff, head on over to mattsagervoiceover.com.